What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. And joining me today is Fedor, as always, but also we have columnist Jimmy Watkins along with us. And today it is another Hey Chris episode. So we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to get into the nuances of this Cavs season, 40-9, best record in the NBA once again. And we're going to get into the 4-game winning streak, all the other things. But there's things outside of the Cavs that are affecting Cleveland right now. And we opened that up to questioning for all of our subtexters, whether that's the Myles Garrett requesting a trade, whether that's the trades around the NBA, the trade deadline coming up this week. All of those questions will be asked, but since we're going to have some fun, and I know the guys had a long night because I did as well. We're recording this at 10 p.m. on Monday evening. I just got back from Max Strus's community event at a bowling alley. It was great. Got to see a lot of the entire Cavs team showed up, even the two-way guys, and front office was there as well. It was Max Strus's first big event in Cleveland as a part of the Cleveland Cavaliers. He's done stuff in Miami. He's done stuff in Chicago in his hometown, all these other things. So it was just great to see all of those different people come together to support Max and them raise some money for charity. The charity will be named at a later date, but more into the fun stuff around today. Chris, when I was sending out text messages, obviously I'm getting back from the, the little event. Jimmy's over here doing his own thing. What were you doing, Chris? And why does that relate to what these Cavs listeners who have been around for a while may know someone that you might have been watching or looking for on your TV?
Well, I was watching The Voice because I watch every single season of The Voice. Doesn't matter who the coaches are, doesn't matter who's going to participate, but this year's Voice obviously has more of a local flavor to it, and this one has a lot more meaning to it, to the point where, you know, my wife and I set up the recordings on our DVR to make sure that even if we're not around, if I'm traveling or something like that, we are recording The Voice because we do not want to miss the opportunity to see Hayden Grove, who my wife calls Hayden Grove, because he has a little Michael Bublé feel to him. You know, Hayden didn't go with that. My wife has pitched that to him for like the last 10 years, basically. And he's sticking with Grove, but every time we go see him performing at Crocker Park or one of the restaurants around town, and Elliot wants to go see him because Elliot loves music and he loves dancing to music and stuff like that, Holly always calls him Hayden Grove. It's very Michael Bublé, and I think it's fitting. I think he should go with it. I totally understand wanting to do his own thing and keeping, you know, his name, and not having a different pronunciation. But, you know, he's supposed to be appearing on this season of The Voice. We don't know what date it's going to be. We don't know how far he goes. We don't know any of those details. But Hayden, obviously, he's a great singer. Everybody in this area knows. He bounces around all the restaurants on the weekends, and he performs, and he does weddings and stuff like that. He does have a very Michael Bublé feel to the way that he performs, the way he dresses. He is a crooner. He's been a singer for as long as I've known him, way before I've known him. So we're just really, really excited. We've got our popcorn ready, waiting to see Hayden perform on The Voice, and we've got the recording set up so that we can, you know, take video of it and stuff like that. And everybody knows that has been listening to this podcast. He was my co-host for a number of years before Ethan arrived. So not only does he talk sports, he talks music, he talks Cleveland, just an all-around great guy, and very, very happy for his success and really, really excited to see him whenever his episode comes on The Voice. And on top of that, you know, this year, Kelsey Ballerini is one of the judges on The Voice. And for those of you that don't know, just, whew, what a delightful lady. What a great performer. What a great songwriter. What a great singer. And what a dime.
Thank you for that elaborate description,
sure.
Chris.
Sure. We
I
all
know
have our celebrity crushes, and she is very close to the top of that list.
Oh, now I have to
On top of
ask
the fact
you,
that she just makes wonderful music that I love listening to.
That's also a good point. Jimmy, now
And I
I got
love
to ask
watching
you.
the videos of the music too.
Of course, got to throw the videos in there. Jimmy, I got to ask you now, though. So since Chris just said that, and we're going to have some fun on today's episode. We're going to get into the nuances. And, of course, Jimmy, we're extremely grateful that you are with us to talk all things Browns and Myles Garrett as well on this Cavs podcast.
Maybe the Browns can get Anthony Davis, 31-year-old Anthony Davis, Max Christie, and a late first-round pick, because I hear that's what generational talent is going for these days. So if the Browns are lucky, maybe, possibly, they can get a package similar to the one that the Dallas Mavericks got.
I mean, I think it's just hilarious that the fact that, like, when you compare NFL players and NBA players, like, size-wise, like, Anthony Davis would be a great tight end. He'd be the perfect fit for all these other situations. But, Jimmy, before we get into that, because we do have a couple of questions from our subtexters about Myles Garrett, and I'm going to let you handle majority of those. Jimmy, who's your celebrity crush? Don't spit your water out on us.
Not ready for that one. At the moment, I am head over heels for Zoe Kravitz. I think it's when she made I think it's a particular role that she played. They remade the High Fidelity movie a few years back, and she was the female lead in that. And she was just like, I think she worked at a record store, and she was all about making playlists. I'm frequently made fun of by my friends for making playlists, like too many playlists I basically track my life through playlists. And so that version of her, that she's so in love with music and takes all this time to arrange it in a certain way, also absolutely beautiful.
I love how it took you time for that. Like, I have a list as long as Kenny Atkinson's play sheet of celebrity crushes that I could just, like, rip off the top of my head. Sydney Sweeney, Tate McRae, Kelsey Ballerini. Like, we can keep going. Britney Spears still, I don't care. She was the first one. That's never going to change.
Hillary Duff was my first one.
But it was like, you had to think about it. That's
for
bizarre.
5 seconds. For 5 seconds.
I think he was caught off guard by the question. I didn't think
I didn't think we were going that way. I feel like it was pretty stream of consciousness. You know what? Next pod, the top 10 most beautiful women in the music and movie business. I'll bring it out for you guys.
You know what's amazing is back when I did radio a number of years ago, I started in radio like 20 years ago. I still do it part-time. We used to do this thing. I created something with a couple of producers at ESPN 850 WKNR where we did this thing called the Hot Mock Draft. So it would be just like, an NFL mock draft or an NBA mock draft, something like that, where each person controlled a different team and you got to pick whoever it was that you wanted to draft based on who was still on the big board. So we created this gigantic community big board with a bunch of different names, like 50, 75, maybe even 100. I can't remember at this point. It was so long ago. And we just picked one by one who was the first pick, who was the second pick, who was the third pick, who was the fourth pick. And it was something that went viral, and it was something that, listeners started participating in. And it was around the time that Twitter just really started. So we started the hashtag Hot Mock Draft and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun.
Was it a snake draft?
It was not a snake draft. No.
Okay. All right.
Although maybe we should have considered that fantasy football style. There's always a benefit to drafting 12th in fantasy football because you get back-to-back picks. But no, we didn't do it snake style. We did it like the NFL draft is set up.
Fair enough. I will say that my celebrity crush forever will be Zendaya. I don't care if she just got engaged. Yeah. Congratulations to her.
Congratulations, indeed.
Yeah, when I went to the Oscars in 2019, that was my sole purpose was going to try and find Zendaya, and she wasn't even she wasn't even at the Academy Awards that year. Just at home chilling, watching it. But
what would you have said to her if you had the opportunity to talk to her?
Dude, I met Keke Palmer. I almost fell out of my seat That's another one. My goodness, it was like, oh my God. What would I have said while looking up to her with her 6-inch heels with my 5'8" self? I like I might have just passed out, Chris. That might have been what happened.
You probably would have thrown out some cheesy pickup line that they use in movies or they used back in college or something like that.
I'm smooth, man. Come on. Cap Alpha Psi, baby. We smooth brothers over here. Don't play with us. But anyway, that's the fun portion of today. And I do want to get into
Ethan would have been like, hey, Zendaya, did it hurt? Zendaya's
Come
like,
on.
What hurt?
Don't
when you
do
fell
that.
from heaven.
The corniness is insane, bro.
Zendaya, I would take you to the movies, but they say I can't bring my own snacks.
That's good. I like that. That's good, man. That's good.
No, that's
I
not
like
good.
Oh man,
Good.
Jimmy, come on now. I know. I could be a wingman for Jimmy any day. He's smooth with it, boy. I tell you what. I'm happily engaged, so I can go out with Jimmy and play wingman, play Cupid. You know what I'm saying? Going into Myles Garrett talk on this Cavs podcast, we have a couple of questions from our subtexters on this. How did we get here? So James in Nebraska says, the trade request from Myles Garrett makes me think about the negotiations between Donovan and the Cavs. Is the only reason that the process was so classy and positive for everyone was that it was only about whether Donovan would be a Cavalier. Could money have ever been a factor? So, Jimmy, I want you to go into first what you've been hearing, what you've been seeing, what you've been thinking of the Myles Garrett request, because I know that you've reported on this before it happened, before just throwing out ideas of what the Browns could do, should do in this scenario before it presented itself. Now that it's here, and we'll let Chris go into the Cavs portion of that.
First of all, shout out to James in Nebraska. I was once a James in Nebraska a couple years ago when I was covering Nebraska football and basketball. I know that life. Second thing is, I think...
Didn't go by Jimmy back then?
Well, it's on the birth certificate, you know? I'm always a James.
Gotcha.
I'm always a James, you know? But
except on your byline.
I don't. Do I? I don't know. I haven't looked in a while. I know when we
That's why I said
started
except on your byline.
Well, yes, except on my byline. No one calls me that. My parents basically tried to get people to call me James for like a week when I was born. Everyone called me Jimmy. It's over. Been over ever since.
Gotcha.
Anyways, I think the Browns should trade Myles Garrett. I think that they are living in an alternate reality where they think that they can. Well, it's all incentives. Andrew Berry wants to keep his job, so he knows that to do that he needs to turn the franchise around, and he is incentivized to do it quickly. The best thing to do is admit, hey, you made a massive mistake, a franchise-altering mistake, and you need to restart this. We need to, purge this aging expensive roster, start anew, and this is the conflict of the Browns offseason. What should you do? What are people incentivized to do? I would trade Myles Garrett. I would shop around other people as well, but that's not what's going to happen because Andrew Berry wants to keep his job. I understand that. To the Myles Garrett trade request, this is the Cavs podcast, but it's not the NBA, man. Like the player empowerment era, we're still waiting on it in the NFL, man. Like Myles Garrett in the NBA, you got a superstar that's got 2 years left on his deal, and he requests a trade. You're on the clock. You can try to convince him over the next 2 seasons, or 1.5 basically, because if you let it get past the trade deadline of the last season, now you're just throwing your hands up on the roller coaster. We'll see what happens. You can try, but that's a massive risk. The NFL has all of these fail safes built in for teams to maintain some of their best players. The franchise tag, where basically, you get an average of the top 5 salary at your position for a year, and it doesn't really matter whether you want to sign it or not. A team just says, I like you. You're on my team. you could do that up to 3 times, and it's the salary goes up. And by the end of it, it gets pretty punitive. But like, we're talking about, I wrote this today, like the idea that the Browns have to trade Myles Garrett now, or else what? he's under contract for until 2026. He could be tagged in 2027. He'll be 32 by then. But the other thing is, the way this gets done in the NBA sometimes, like Jimmy Butler lighting a front office on fire, just doesn't happen in football as often. Like, I guess Antonio Brown could be an example. That's not a guy you want on your team. Myles is not that kind of guy. He threw Andrew. I thought it was a nice touch, a nice little clutch influence potentially. Myles is rep by Clutch Sports, for him to throw Andrew Berry's own words back in his face in the trade request today. The idea that Andrew Berry is saying that Myles will have a ticket straight from Cleveland to Canton, and Myles said, "It's not about Cleveland to Canton. I'm trying to win a Super Bowl here." That's great. As a writer, I appreciate that, but it doesn't really change the reality of the situation here, which is that Andrew Berry is not incentivized to trade Myles Garrett because he's trying to win soon. And Myles Garrett doesn't have a ton of leverage in the situation that we're talking about here. So that's kind of long and short. I think it's going to be a staring contest. And I think that if you want to believe that this is something of a negotiation ploy for Myles, I think that you have a leg to stand on, because I think this is going to end with Andrew Berry giving Myles Garrett a very fat paycheck sometime over the next several months.
Look, I mean, I think it all depends on how a player goes about it and how difficult they choose to make it on the organization. When Kyrie demanded his trade from the Cavs almost 10 years ago at this point, like, he made it known in no uncertain terms that he didn't want to play another minute with LeBron James. Like, he was done with the LeBron thing. He stormed into the office. He dropped expletives. He made demands. It's all because he didn't want to play with LeBron. And Kyrie threatened knee surgery. Like, Kyrie told them what it was going to be like in no uncertain terms if they did not trade him. And if they did not trade him, they weren't going to have him. He wasn't going to play. So it put a different level of pressure on the Cavs front office. And the Cavs were in a situation that was interesting because they were competing for a championship. Even if they weren't going to have Kyrie, they still had LeBron. They still had Kevin Love. They still had championship aspirations. So, like, the last thing that you want to do as an organization is do something that is going to threaten your ability to chase those dreams, right? The Browns situation's a little bit different. You know, they're not coming off a playoff appearance. They're not coming off a finals appearance. They're not expected to be one of the better teams in the AFC North, in the AFC. They're expected to be a team that, you know, who knows what direction they're going to go. Like, I think a lot of people are wondering what direction they're going to go this offseason, and a lot of it ties into the quarterback. But I think when you're an organization like the Cavs were at that time that had these lofty expectations, you're like, we can't do anything to ruin that. Like, we can't prevent LeBron from trying to chase another championship. And I think they felt like Kyrie was going to be such a hindrance to that, and the whole situation was going to be a cloud over the organization, that they almost had no choice but to move him. And the things that they got, obviously, it was a little bit for the future and it was a little bit for the here and now. And you can go back and you can say that they should have gotten more for Kyrie or whatever the case may be. But I think the situation that the organization was in played a part in it. And I think the difficulty that Kyrie tried to make it for the organization played a part in it. And if Myles wants to make things difficult for the Browns, he can make things difficult for the Browns. He can make it so that they feel like they've got to move on from him. But Jimmy, to your point, like, I definitely think that they need to be saved from themselves, their own blunders here over the last couple of years. And Myles is basically giving them a life preserver. Because if you trade Myles Garrett, you get a haul. I don't know exactly what the haul would be. I don't know what the package would look like. but it allows you to start again. Now, are you going to get somebody as talented as Myles Garrett? Probably not. But you can get multiple pieces that are going to help you expedite this rebuild and maybe save you from yourself. The problem is, like, who's making those decisions? Like, who's the guy who's going to turn all of the pieces from a potential Myles Garrett trade into something that matters? If it's Andrew Barry, how do you have any faith that he's the guy that's going to pull off, one, the right deal for Myles Garrett, and two, take all of those pieces that the Browns would theoretically get back in return for Myles and do enough with them so that it matters for the future of the organization?
I like what you said
Hey,
about the
Chris,
life
just to
preserver, Chris. Oh, sorry. I thought I like what you said about the life preserver that Miles just threw them, because it's like so much of this is ownership management too, right? Because it's way easier to sell to Haslam Sports Ownership Group, or whatever they call themselves, Jimmy and Dee, our friends, if you want to call them that. Like, hey, my hands are tied here.
The ill-equipped.
Miles, yeah, the ill-equipped. My hands are tied here. Miles is forcing us. I'm trying to show my tied hands in the camera. There we go. My hands are tied here.
Yes. Yeah.
My hands are tied here. Miles is forcing us. Well, I guess we got to just, put one foot in front of the other and try to make all these draft picks. That's. I could see that. If you sell it the right way, I could see them saying, okay, well, I guess this is just what we're doing now. Maybe that gives you a little bit more leash. The problem is, whose leash are we lengthening? It's not just that I don't trust Andrew Barry because his draft record. I mean, obviously the Deshaun Watson trade erodes basically all the trust that if you had a ton before, you have zero now, regardless of how much you had before.
Right.
And then it's like, look at the premium draft pick record. It's Greg Newsome. Okay. Jed Wills, a free agent. We'll see, I guess. If he's coming back, it's on a prove it deal, that sort of thing. So the other thing about the Miles picks, and this is true in any sport, you trade an incredible player. The type of teams who are going to be interested in him are going to be teams who think they are close to winning. And those teams don't pick high in the draft. So now it's a guy. Yeah. Now you're trusting the general manager that we don't trust to draft above his pay grade. And look, JOK, nice pick. I think we can all agree. Grant Delpit, injuries in the beginning, nice, turned out to be a nice player for a second round pick. But we just you use the 10 pick on Jed Wills. You use whatever pick Greg Newsome was, 20s, on Greg Newsome. That's what we have to go off of right now. That plus the worst trade in NFL history. And the other thing I would say, I don't want to get too far down this road. Yeah, in sports history. The other thing, I don't want to get too far down the Browns road. It's just Miles is going to be 30, and NFL teams don't toss around draft picks willy-nilly the same way that NBA teams do. These draft picks are the lifeblood of your franchise. It's how you retool your roster every year, particularly when you're good. So I agree they would get a haul. I just think when people picture haul, they think, oh, we're set for a Deshaun Watson-esque haul. I don't think it's that. I really don't think it's that.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a quarterback. At the end of the day, there's a different value placed on the position that Myles Garrett plays versus, somebody like Deshaun Watson a number of years ago. So that's part of the equation. The other thing is, and there's no way around this, their own missteps, the one giant misstep that they made with Deshaun Watson has cost them Myles Garrett, potentially, the prime of Nick Chubb, 3 first-round picks. It may cost them Kevin Stefanski. Who knows what's going to happen with his future. And it's just, that's the trade, that's the blunder that keeps coming back to this organization. And I hate to put it like this because I know that fans are going to be really, really upset about it, but they deserve it. You make a deal with the devil. Sorry. Nobody is going to feel bad for you that particular decision, the one that was so controversial, the one that was, you probably should have done a little bit more to not make it as Deshaun Watson friendly as what you did. nobody is going to feel bad for you that particular deal blew up in your face.
And I want to bring this back to the Cavs, right? Because James in Nebraska did ask a question about how this related to just this past summer when Donovan Mitchell was up for an extension, and how the negotiations were a lot smoother than they have been in the past when it comes to Cleveland sports teams as a whole, especially this one when people are requesting trades, especially when you talk about a guy that we mentioned we mentioned this on the podcast the other day about how Donovan Mitchell, like the Cavs took a chance that Donovan Mitchell was going to come and resign. He was going to come and get an extension. Like it was a risk worth taking with the upside that if he stays, the ceiling and the trajectory of this team then changes for instead of 2 seasons, 5, maybe 7 seasons, right? Especially when you talk about Donovan Mitchell accruing 10 years of service and being up for another extension that could get into the Supermax contract deals that we will get into later down the line when we want to feel a little bit more nerdy. But, Chris, when it came to the discussions with Donovan, just to reiterate James and Nebraska's question, is the only reason that the process was so classy and positive for everyone was that it was only about whether Donovan would be a Cavalier. Could money have ever been a factor?
Well, money's always a factor. But the amount of money that the Cavs could give Donovan was the same that anybody else could give Donovan. So there just wasn't a big negotiation when it came to that. Like the money was the money. The offer was always going to be the offer, and it was set. They weren't going to offer him less than the max. It was, what's the most that we can give to Donovan? The debate was, okay, what's the right term in years? Like what kinds of things do you want within that contract? What kinds of things are we okay giving within that contract? So there are little things that they had to figure out with that, length of the deal, where's the player option, that kind of stuff. But I think it comes down to this, guys. Donovan wanted to be here. Donovan made up his mind that there just, as the season was going on, there just wasn't going to be a better basketball situation for him. Not where he could chase a championship. So, yeah, I'm sure Donovan looked at the landscape of the NBA, and his agent looked at the landscape of the NBA as the season was progressing. He had to. That's part of his responsibility. That's part of Donovan's agent's responsibility. Figure out who's interested, figure out what's out there, figure out what's realistic, and where was he going to go that was going to give him a better chance to compete for a championship than Cleveland, a team that was coming off an Eastern Conference semifinals appearance, a team that had Darius Garland, Evan Mobley already under contract, effectively under contract, and had Jared Allen effectively under contract, and had all these different pieces that Donovan had played alongside, believed in when he was playing alongside them, knew that his style could fit alongside of them, and all those different factors. There was probably a time early in Donovan's career, and him and I have talked about this a few different times, where he thought he needed something bigger. He needed a market bigger. But he didn't feel that anymore. As his career progressed, that feeling has changed. He got a shoe deal in Utah, right? He became playoff Spida in Utah. He became, one of the top players in the NBA in Utah. So it's he didn't need New York for all that stuff. He didn't need Miami for all that stuff. He didn't need LA for all that stuff. He became one of the more popular players in the entire NBA in little old Utah. So Cleveland is just fine. Cleveland gives him every single opportunity that he would want for himself out of his career. And the most important one to him from the very beginning, he said this, and he doubled down on it. And every time he had an opportunity to talk about it, he said it, and then he backed it up by inking the contract. Winning. He's chasing championships. And he felt like, as the season was going on last year, that the Cavs gave him the opportunity to do that. He saw the growth of Evan Mobley. He saw the potential of Evan Mobley. He knew what Darius Garland was going through, and he knew that it was probably an aberration of a season for him. So all those different things, like, there are so many things that go into any kind of contract negotiation, but it was made so much easier because Donovan didn't want to go anywhere else. Donovan wanted to be here, and he had made up his mind basically in January that this is where he wanted to be. And it was just about, all right, what are the smaller terms within a contract that we have to work through?
I just want to finish this needle that we're threading between the Donovan Myles conversation. Another key difference between these two sports, the way they're structured, is the max salary in the NBA. To a certain, I mean, there's different levels, obviously, based on experience, based on end of year accomplishments, right? All NBA, Defensive Player of the Year, MVP, all that's different stuff can qualify you for a Supermax. Again, your experience, 35% of the cap, whether that, that affects what kind of max you get. Whereas in football, it's kind of free market out there, right? Like, Jamar Chase wants to be, Justin Jefferson gets this, and then Jamar Chase's contract is up next. They're both two of the top 5 receivers in the NFL. It's all about timing. The highest paid quarterback in the league is usually the latest one that a team believes in, right? And now Myles Garrett is due an extension, and I have an idea. I think that he wants to be paid like the highest non-quarterback, the most valuable non-quarterback in the NFL. And you know what? Right now, as we sit here, after coming off his age 29 season, where he finished second in the league in sacks, right after, by the way, after he went through a 3-week drought with no sacks during the season, and that coming off of the heels of a Defensive Player of the Year type season. Of course, Myles Garrett's one of, if not the most valuable non-quarterback in the NFL. But Andrew Berry's job, even if you don't believe he's very good at it, is to consider whether Myles Garrett will be worth that when he's 33 or 34 or however long this contract extension is going to go. And this is where it gets tricky, because Myles Garrett is in his prime right now. He's in his prime. He should get every penny he can. But he's not going to be forever. And frankly, these contracts tend to be front-loaded, so there would be some cap relief on the front end of it. Andrew Berry would love to give Myles an extension and move some of one thing we know Andrew Berry's good at is cooking the books, right? Because he's had a lot of experience doing it with the Deshaun Watson contract, among others. But it all comes home to roost at some point. So it's not just, is Myles Garrett going to be one of the most valuable non-quarterbacks in the league at that point? Are we still going to be in a position, because you're not right now. Right now you're 3-14. Are you still going to be in a position to compete on a grand level? I mean, the Browns would step one's playoffs, but by then you'd like to have a shot at something bigger, and your books are just, there's only so much cooking you can do.
So I want to, while we're on this trade topic, and I appreciate, Jimmy, that insight and the guidance on the NFL, just grand scheme of things, very insightful. And when we're talking about the age of these players, and this will go into one of our next subtexters' questions. It's coming from Ben Y in Akron. He says, because we talked about the Luka and the De'Aaron Fox trades in our last podcast, he says, do the Luka and Fox trades reset the trade market and make someone like Cam Johnson more attainable for us? What I mean is this. Both players were attained for far less than their actual perceived value in regards to draft capital. Would this make a package that Cleveland can offer more enticing for Brooklyn? And I don't want to necessarily go into this specific question, but I want to broaden it out a little bit, because I think Ben Y has some good portions in this conversation. The first being how all of the NBA became significantly more aware that they are, I don't know if the word I want to use is vulnerable, but like nobody is indispensable. Like there are very few untouchables in the NBA, right?
Mm.
And we talked about there are other teams pursuing, like the Golden State Warriors are reportedly pursuing Kevin Durant again, 36-year-old Kevin Durant, right? And what he can do at his age, at his stature, for a team that is trying to get back into contention. The Golden State Warriors are going after so many different players, trying to pair Stephen Curry with another all-star caliber player. And we talked about this again on our latest podcast when talking about how the first domino to fall, being Luka Doncic and Anthony Davis, ended up being the biggest domino and will have an effect on every other trade conversation for the remainder of the trade deadline. Obviously, we know that's coming up on Thursday at 3 p.m., so people are moving swiftly. But how do you guys characterize and perceive how the Luka Doncic trade and Anthony Davis trade, along with De'Aaron Fox and that kind of deal, have affected the decisions and the discussions that are being had league-wide? And does that open up the floodgates for other teams to try and pursue guys that may have been perceived as unattainable or not on the market?
Well, guys, I think the first thing is it emboldens a lot of these front offices to just have a conversation about whoever it may be. Even if it does seem very, very far-fetched, you just don't know. The other thing that I would say is when it comes to Luka, when it comes to De'Aaron Fox, when it comes to Kevin Durant, when it comes to Jimmy Butler, these high-salaried players, there are only so many teams that can realistically get involved with those conversations. Because, like, if you want that type of high-salary player, you have to have at least one high-salary guy that you're willing to move, right? Like, if you look at the De'Aaron Fox deal, there was a 3-team deal, and part of that is because, there was a team willing to move a high-salary player, and it was Zach LaVine. But he was, like, always going to be available. So, like, you pull them into it, and you float them some stuff, not very quality stuff based on what the Bulls got back, but you pull them into it, so that it makes it a little bit easier to match those salaries. Like, that's always going to be a starting point of any trade in the NBA, especially with the limitations of the new CBA, especially with the restrictions of the new CBA. So, like, if you want to have a conversation about Kevin Durant, that's fine, but, like, you better have $50 million that you're willing to send out in that deal. Golden State can have that conversation because Andrew Wiggins makes like $30 million and they consider him, quote unquote, expendable. And then all of a sudden they just have to cobble together, 2, 3 more guys, or maybe pull in a third or a fourth team or something like that. For the Cavs, they're high salary guys. Cavs don't want to move any of them, and they shouldn't want to. They're 40-9 for Christ's sake. They're the best team in the Eastern Conference. They are a legitimate championship contender. They don't have to go into this trade deadline feeling like we have to do something. If we don't do something here, we can't compete for a championship. They don't have to have that mentality. There's no reason for them to have that mentality. So it's like part of the reason why Karis LeVert keeps being brought up and why teams around the NBA that are calling the Cavs, the guy that's being discussed the most is Karis LeVert, is because, like, that's the logical contract to make a deal with Atlanta for DeAndre Hunter, Brooklyn for Cam Johnson, Portland for Jeremy Grant. Like, that's the logical contract as the starting point of those conversations. It's not as much that these teams value Karis that much. Like, part of it is they do, because one, he's having a very good season. He's still an effective player, and he's on an expiring contract. And that gives any team that is looking for salary cap space, it gives them that opportunity. But it's also like the Cavs' best pathway to get to that particular salary number. So, like, if you're talking about Brandon Ingram, if you're talking about Kevin Durant, if you're talking about Jimmy Butler, not every team can realistically be involved in those conversations, because not every team has a quote unquote expendable player that makes around 30 to 50 million dollars that just like makes a starting point, a jumping off point for any type of trade. So I guess this goes back to like Cam Johnson is realistic from the Cavs standpoint because his number is not 30 to 35 to 40 million dollars. It's one that fits within the parameters that they would be comfortable, getting to. It fits within the parameters of the types of players that they would be more willing to actually consider moving in a deal if they feel like the player coming back is worth it enough for them. But I don't know that, Luka getting traded or De'Aaron Fox getting traded has all of a sudden, in fact, like it hasn't changed the Cavs stance of we have to be really, really judicious here when it comes to the trade deadline, because this is a delicate situation. And we understand that no roster is perfect, but we have a lot of things that we should feel good about when it comes to this roster. And if we're going to make any kind of addition to this team, it's also going to come as a result of subtracting multiple role players that have helped us get to 40-9. And the Cavs don't have to do anything at the trade deadline. That is their feeling right now. And I don't blame them for having that kind of feeling. It's different when you're Dallas, right? It's different when you're Phoenix. It's different when you're Miami. Like those teams feel like they had to do something, and they do have to do something to take the next step as an organization.
The funniest thing about the Luka Doncic and Anthony Davis trades and how like they were looked at as indispensable, like they were not attainable by any team because they were so valued by their organizations, all these other things, was that like on social media, on the internet, like people are like seeing all these like injury reports with players who are consistently out or had been injured for a significant period, and they're like starting to make their recovery, and they're like, oh, they're questionable now for the game coming up this week, or Joel Embiid and Paul George might be coming back sooner than they have expected. And like I think it's hitting not only players around the NBA but also just people around the world and fans of the game that are realizing that. And Giannis, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant talked about it like after they found out the news in their post-game press conferences about how like if Luka can get moved, if Anthony Davis can get moved, anybody's up for grabs. And Jimmy, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the entire situation and how Ben Y is asking and trying to figure out, is anybody available? Because we had the hypothetical conversation about Evan Mobley is probably the most untouchable player outside of Donovan Mitchell for the Cavs. But Jimmy, I just want to know your thought process when you think and look around at these injury reports getting updated and other players starting to make their returns maybe more quickly than they might have wanted to.
I can tell you Wemby's not available. I can tell you Jokic is not available. I can tell you those types of players still do fall into the category of untouchable. There are some that still fall into the category of untouchable, even though it feels like, one of the supposed untouchables got moved by a really questionable organization. Let's just put it that way.
I'll tell you this. I don't know if it means everybody is available, but I think it means everybody's getting called about now. It's like, well, hey, I don't want to miss. If there's ever another one of these, I would like to be in on it. And you can bet that there are some owners. I think this is real. I think some owners saw that trade and went in and rattled their general manager's cage over, why didn't you know about this? Why weren't we in on this? And the general manager is saying, well, they only talk to each other. And it doesn't matter because it's kind of your job to know, right? Like, and that's not fair because they're only talking to each other. And Nico Harrison, Mr. Unbelievable, is thanking Rob Pelinka for not telling anybody about this trade because of course he wouldn't. But it's like, you know what? Like, I'm a billionaire owner. I don't care about that. You should have known. You should have been in on this. Yeah. So you better be making every freaking call you can. Like the Warriors right now, it's an interesting vibe shift that we've had with the Warriors. Because what, 2 weeks ago it was kind of, they didn't get any better or worse in the standings, and 2 weeks ago it was kind of like, well, Steph and Draymond and Steve Kerr were saying, well, you have to be careful about the future, and you don't want to you don't want to mortgage too much if you don't think you can win big now. Now the Warriors are literally calling every single team. Jake Fisher saying they're literally calling every single team of asking about all-stars, because I bet you Joe Lacob went into Mike Dunleavy's office and said, if Luka can be had, anybody can be had, especially from the perspective of Mr. Lightyears himself. I do think most trades are their own organisms, though. I don't think that, like Chris was saying yesterday, we can't be comparing picks on all these different trades, because every negotiation is its own animal. And I would also say that now that I do think that there are other moves to be made for both the Lakers and Dallas, but I just feel like the kind of players that they are interested, like the Lakers have different needs from the Cavs. I mean, I guess everyone can use a little bit of a 3-and-D wing these days, but I think the Lakers are out there searching for a center right now. I think the Mavericks are probably out there searching for a secondary creator next to Kyrie Irving, which is a little bit different than what the Cavs are searching for. I'm fascinated just to spin this conversation forward a little bit, the conversation around the Cavs 2031 first round pick right now, because the other key difference between the Cavs and these other teams that feel like they need to make trades, not only are their teams not good enough, a lot of these teams are freaking old. Like the Suns don't have time to sit and marinate in the sun and count on internal development, because Kevin Durant is not going to get better. He's amazing. It's incredible how he's aged into his late 30s, but he's only going to get older, and he has not necessarily been the most durable player as he has aged. Same goes with the Lakers and LeBron. Same goes with the Warriors and Steph. And the Cavs are in an interesting position where their conflict right now is, well, man, how many years are you going to start 40-9 and have a cakewalk to the 1 seed for the rest of the season, assuming everyone stays healthy, knock on wood, all that stuff, right? So you might as well go for it, right? At the same time, 2031 is still a long ways away, and you want to protect yourself for the future, particularly if you're a small market team, particularly given the new cap environment. That is my most fascinating rub to watch with the Cavs this week.
Well, I do think something did happen last night that benefits the Cavs from the perspective of Cam Johnson. And I hate continuing to bring up Cam Johnson, but that's the player that Cavs fans have fallen in love with. That's the player that the Cavs have loved for a number of years, and that's the player who is most frequently linked to the Cavs in any kind of trade conversation. Sacramento was a real impediment. Sacramento had pieces that were appealing to the Brooklyn Nets because of a combination of contracts, young players, and draft picks. Look, two of those players are now in Chicago. So some of the pieces that Sacramento was theoretically going to use to try and entice Brooklyn to trade away Cam Johnson, they no longer have those. So it feels like you can take Sacramento out of the Cam Johnson mix. And now you start talking about Indiana's still interested. Memphis has a need for somebody like Cam Johnson. He would make a ton of sense for Oklahoma City. So there are still a bunch of Cam Johnson pursuers out there, and there should be. He is one of the most valuable players on the trade market that remains. And he's the kind of player that a lot of contending teams would have an interest in, because you want versatility, you want shooting, you want somebody who can space the floor and make things easier on your offense. You want somebody who can guard multiple positions, and he's not a great defender. Their numbers with him on the court and off the court, they are a better team on the defensive end of the floor with him off the court. But he theoretically can guard multiple positions because of his size, because of his length, because of his athleticism. So contending teams are still going to be interested in him. Like I said, Indiana, Memphis, Oklahoma City, those teams all make sense just like Cleveland does. But Sacramento was a real threat. Like there were people around the NBA that believed Sacramento had the package that people had to beat. Like Sacramento had the one that was most appealing to Brooklyn, and somebody was going to have to top that. Well, that one no longer exists. So that certainly helps the Cavs if Cam Johnson is somebody that they believe is that much of an upgrade, and if they're willing to pay that price.
So one last fun thing before we get into our brief preview of tomorrow's game between the Boston Celtics and the Cleveland Cavaliers, because I feel like we still do have to do that, even if slightly. But there's some buzz around the league currently, or around the internet, around social media, about how the Detroit Pistons are a team to be feared. Not necessarily because they're one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference this season. They're in the playoff hunt, but because of how they have affected teams throughout the season, allegedly. The Pistons beat the Sacramento Kings. The next day, the Kings fired Mike Brown. The Pistons beat the Dallas Mavericks. The next day, the Dallas Mavericks traded Luka Doncic. The Pistons beat the Bulls. The same day, the Bulls traded Zach LaVine. And obviously, we've talked about salary dump conversation on this podcast. We talked about how Sam Merrill falls into that category. Tristan Thompson, Kirk Porter Jr. as well are different situations for that. But the Cavs also do travel to Detroit to play the Pistons on Wednesday. Not that there should be any fear among Cavs fans or anything like that. I just thought it was a funny antidote to plug in there about how the Pistons have become one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference and competitive in their first year under J.B. Bickerstaff. I know it may seem like we're giving a lot of praise to J.B. In his first year away from the Cavs, but it's true. Obviously, the Atlanta Hawks did defeat the Pistons, so they might be safe from any more news hitting them. Obviously, also without Jalen Johnson, so that's something to note. But I think the best way for the Cavs to avoid anything being attached to them in name history when it comes to the Detroit Pistons and any further with J.U. Bickerstaff is just to beat the Pistons on Wednesday as they travel to Detroit. But nonetheless...
Well, I'll also say that this is the benefit of having a measured front office the way that the Cavs are. Like, this is not a reactionary organization. It hasn't been for the last couple of years. They've taken a patient approach. When people were saying that Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell didn't work and they needed to get split up, they were laughing at that. They were pulling up stats to debate that. When people said that Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley wasn't going to work together, they basically told people to bleep themselves and stop calling about Jarrett Allen and stop calling about these trades and stuff like that. When the Cavs went into this situation last year where Darius was going to be out for 6 weeks and Evan was going to be out for 6 weeks, and teams around the NBA were like, oh yeah, let us go get Donovan Mitchell because they can't survive, because they're going to plummet down the standings. The Cavs were like, stop calling about Donovan Mitchell. We're not trading Donovan Mitchell. There is no chance of us trading Donovan Mitchell. And like, that's the benefit of having that kind of front office that operates that kind of way, that doesn't allow like a losing streak to change their approach, or doesn't allow, a stretch being without a certain player change the way that they view things, or a bad season from Darius Garland change the way that they view Darius Garland and his importance to the organization and stuff like that. And I will say that, not every front office in the NBA operates that kind of way. Not every ownership group in the NBA operates that kind of way. And Dan Gilbert hasn't always operated that kind of way. Like, he was somebody in the past that had an itchy trigger finger. He was somebody in the past that, often demanded moves to be made, and he was more heavily involved in these basketball-related decisions. But Kobe Altman is somebody that has been alongside Dan Gilbert for more than a decade now. Kobe Altman is somebody who Dan Gilbert believes in, who Dan Gilbert trusts. who has given him power within this organization to make these kinds of moves. So it's just like a different way that the Cavs operate. One, these days compared to the past, and two, it's a different way that they operate compared to some front offices that have a different kind of ticking clock.
I think they weren't. Dan Gilbert wasn't the only one with the itchy trigger finger. About this time every year, LeBron James was talking at his locker saying, basically giving the GM a wish list for what he thought the Cavs could use as an upgrade. Yes. So I think having LeBron on your team is such a unique experience. The pressure that comes with having to cater to history, essentially. And by the way, that pressure is a privilege, like the athletes say about a lot of different things. You would much rather have LeBron James on your team than not have LeBron James on your team. I'm saying obvious things into my laptop right now. But I think it's interesting how the Cavs have de-LeBronified themselves. And then one quick thing to the Donovan point. I think this is an under-discussed part of the Luka trade. I saw Nate Jones, who I think is Damian Lillard's agent or is an agent in basketball, talking about how
he is an agent.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he was saying that, like, on Twitter yesterday, that Luka Doncic, the reason that the Mavs aren't shopping Luka Doncic to 30 teams is because the second that this narrative gets out that Luka might be on the market, Luka's going to try and control where he's going. And then you have to trade to that team because that's how the NBA works. And your return is going to be limited as a result. The Cavs said, F that. That's not how this works. We're going to try and take a gamble. Donovan Mitchell wants to go to New York. We're going to bring him to Cleveland, and we're going to see what happens. And it freaking worked. The Milwaukee Bucks, the result of the experiment still to be determined, saw, Damian Lillard wants to go to Miami? We don't care. We're going to bring him to Milwaukee, have him play with Giannis, and see how that works out for you. He's still on the contract that he signed when he got there, and the Bucks haven't done anything since he's gotten there, largely in part due to injuries. But I'm just saying, it doesn't have to be this way. I know that a lot of organizations operate this way, but I would argue that operating out of fear is not how you want to run your franchise.
With the Luka thing that you bring up, Jimmy, because you bring up the parallels of LeBron, like there was always a saying in this organization for those 4 straight years of, we understand that there are things that come with having LeBron on our team. Like there are concessions that you have to make. There are people that you have to hire. There are different ways that there are practices that are going to get canceled. There are games that are going to get punted during the regular season. There are public statements that he's going to make that put a lot of pressure on the front office and all these different things. But the Cavs always said for those 4 years, we don't care because it's always worth it. No matter what we have to deal with, the drama, the tweeting, the passive aggressiveness, like all of that stuff, we don't care because it's always going to be worth it because he's always going to give us a chance to win a championship. And it's just bizarre to me that Dallas didn't have that same feeling with Luka because it had been worth it. Like from day one that they acquired Luka, it had always been worth it. And yeah, there were things that obviously Dallas had to deal with. There was probably some moodiness, He wasn't somebody who got along with everybody that they brought there to that organization. Look at the Kristaps Porzingis situation. Maybe it means you have to fire coaches. Maybe it means you have to hire certain people. Like whatever the case, that's the life of dealing with a star player. Like that's what you sign up for. And for Dallas to look at everything that he had accomplished to that point, including 2 conference finals appearances, an NBA finals appearance, like all the different individual accolades that he had, and just making Dallas one of the most relevant franchises in the NBA during the time that Luka was there. I can't believe that they looked at that situation and said to themselves, it's not worth it. Because, most teams would look at it and say, we don't care. We're going to deal with it because it's going to be worth it, because it has been worth it. So, not every star player is worth it. Like all the concessions that you have to make, all the drama, all the headaches and stuff like that. Not everybody is LeBron. Not everybody is Luka. Not everybody is Wemby, right? But most of the time, when you have that kind of megastar, it's going to be worth it. And you just deal with all of the nonsense that you have to deal with and understand that that's part of it. That's part of dealing with a star player.
And I think it's funny that you mentioned that, Chris, like dealing with a star player, but also like knowing what it takes to keep them happy. And it's been reported with Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks that like there were multiple people that were let go or fired or whatever word you want to use that Luka had a like significant or strong relationship with that were around him, whether it was player development, whether it was strength and conditioning, whether it was like inside the organization. There were multiple people that were let go. And it just seemed like, and obviously there's other things that go into this, but there were like videos of after they clinched the NBA Finals with somebody taking away Luka Doncic's beer. Like there are so many different things.
Michael Finley.
Fair. Right. Okay.
Not
but like
somebody.
there's so many things.
Like a key member of their front office
in Mavericks history.
Nope, you can't have this.
and like how defeated he looked after that was like insane, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that like what you're alluding to, Chris, is like there are some players that are worth keeping happy no matter the price. It felt like for a guy that was first team All NBA 5 different times by the age of 25, like he would be one of those. But it seemed, and what has been reported, that it's been the opposite. But enough of that stuff, because I want to get into our final topic. We're already an hour in, and we're going to do this quickly because there's not a whole lot to talk about. But the Boston Celtics come to town on Tuesday to face the Cleveland Cavaliers. And obviously, every time the Cavs faced the Boston Celtics, the team that knocked them out of the Eastern Conference semifinals in 5 games last year, it's an event. And Kenny Atkinson has not officially said, but alluded to that there have been times earlier this season where they have over-prepared for a game against a team in the NBA earlier this season. We can try and put the pieces together and figure it out that it might have been the Boston Celtics earlier this year. But the biggest thing for me, and Chris, I mentioned this earlier, is that everybody was at Max Strus's event earlier today, like bowling, having fun, enjoying themselves. I don't expect them to have a long shoot around tomorrow, especially after being out until 10 o'clock or whatever it was when they got out of there. But like, is it obviously earlier in the season, it was a bigger deal because they wanted their revenge. They wanted all these other things. Now that they've beaten them and lost to them in the same season, is this as big of a matchup as it once was earlier in the year? Or is this just another game that allows the Cavs to showcase that they're an offensive firepower and trying to showcase that they're still a defensive identity-minded team when it comes to playing against the Boston Celtics? And I have to look at the injury report before I go into who is available and who is not and how that will affect the game as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime that the Cavs play against one of the best teams in the NBA, there's going to be something more to it. But this just doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel the same as the first meeting with Boston or the revenge game with Boston. It doesn't feel the same as the first meeting against Oklahoma City or the second one against Oklahoma City. It feels more like a normal game as much as a game against Boston, the second best team in the Eastern Conference based on record currently, as normal as that can feel, especially when you know it's going to be on national TV. So yeah, I mean, I think there are certain things that you're going to look at. You're always going to look at games against Boston, New York, Milwaukee, Oklahoma City, Memphis, Denver as a little bit different in terms of regular season stakes and what you can learn and what you can gain and what kinds of things that Kenny Atkinson's going to be looking for to kind of translate into playoff success down the road. But it just doesn't feel to me as big as the other ones did. Part of it is because the trade deadline's right around the corner. This is the dog days of the NBA schedule. And the other part of it is like the main the main storylines surrounding the previous two meetings, like those don't exist to the same level at this point.
I do still think, though, I mean, you know who really doesn't think it's a big deal is the Boston Celtics, who have been treating regular season games like scrimmages at certain points the last couple of weeks. I think they have 10 of their 15 losses in the last 2 months or something like that. I think that's something I'm thinking about. I was asking Tristan Thompson about this.
By the regular season.
I was asking Tristan Thompson about this after the Mavericks shellacking on Sunday, and he was, because it's a direct parallel. Like, remember the championship era Cavs in the regular season, night to night, you just didn't really know what you were going to get. I mean, certain games that